over to Don Como.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for all of you who are able to log in today. I am so thrilled to introduce Dr. Michelle Bennett. This is actually her 4th year coming to do this training for us, and we know that each time it's been incredibly valuable to all of our participants. And given everything going on in the world, we're particularly thankful to have her time this morning. So Dr. Bennett is the director for the Center for Research Strategy at the National Cancer Institute at the NIH. And that's a science-based office that collaboratively develops recommendations for addressing scientific opportunities and also monitors the direction and application of NCI's scientific knowledge and resources. Part of this role of the office is to identify research funding gaps. And prior to this role, she has a long history of working in research. She served as the Deputy Scientific Director for the Division of Intramural Research at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And before that, she was the Deputy Director for NCI's Center for Cancer Research. So Dr. Bennett, as you'll learn over the course of the next hour and a half or so, has extensive practical and professional experience working with a wide range of teams in very diverse sciences. And so we're thrilled that she'll be able to take some of what she talks about in her field guide for team science, which I believe we distributed to all of you via the invite, and we'll follow up and send it to you again. She has a published guide on team science that's very popular and helpful. So we hope that she'll be able to share some of those important lessons with you over the next 75 to 90 minutes. So again, she's highly sought after by individuals, teams, and organizations to give these trainings. We're so thrilled to have her today. I happen to remember that in the last series of trainings, she often has talking about SARS. So I feel like today, while we're working and trying to figure out the pandemic of COVID-19, it's even more important to think about how is it we can effectively work and sustain teams in understanding very complex scientific problems. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Bennett to lead our session today, and I hope you will take the opportunity to engage with your questions through chat. I have the pleasure of seeing Dr. Bennett present and teach in a number of different forums, and I know how welcoming she is to hearing your ideas. So even though we're on Zoom, I hope you'll take advantage of the next hour and a half we have together today. And thank you, Dr. Bennett, for being here. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Dawn, for that awesome introduction. I've really enjoyed all of my visits to Emory, Morehouse, the Georgia CTSA, so it's great to be back. If you had asked me how many years it was, I wouldn't probably be able to answer, so I think we're on a great roll. I will just reinforce that would love to hear your questions. This is not my preferred format. Dawn knows that, Henry knows that, I think Kayla knows that. I really like the interactive work, and so doing this virtually and just looking at a computer screen is typically not the way that I do this. But that said, I'm really happy to be here and able to share with you given the given where we are today. It's amazing that we've got this technology at our disposal, and that we can do this. So let's see, without much further ado, I am going to work on sharing my screen here. And get it into presenter mode. Oh, I have to go up to the top, I think. Let's try this. There we go. Why don't we just get started? As Dawn mentioned, one of the things I do like to talk about is SARS, and I am actually going to talk about SARS, not SARS-CoV-2, which we're dealing with right now, but the SARS of the early 2000s. And so I think the first thing that I really want to say is that I recognize, and I've recognized in the work that I've done, that science brings teams together. It's really the question at hand. It's really the complexity of what needs to be solved that requires people to come together, I think today more than ever. It might have been, 30, 40 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago in some areas, where you could be a lone investigator in your laboratory and not really have a requirement to work with other people. But I think that's really changed a lot. The questions we have, the problems we're facing have not only become more complex, but they also require more involvement from a diversity of people from different sectors. And so, if we take a look at what's happening now, it's not just researchers, but it's healthcare professionals, it's politicians, it's economists, very, very broad. And I see that happening in a lot of sectors and in a lot of research areas. So what I really would like to do today is convince you that while I understand that the research is really important and it sits at the center. So if you kind of look at this diagram, it sits in the center of everything and all the interactions. What I want to try to convince you of today is that all of those factors that are surrounding your research, like vision and trust and institutional support and communication and power, sharing credit and resources, setting expectations, that those things are equally important. And that if you do not spend some time thinking about these in the context of whatever team you're working on, whether you're a leader or a participant, the research can potentially suffer. And what do I mean by that? By not tending to some of the things, you end up not spending the time doing the research. You actually spend your time on trying to mend relationships or dealing with emergencies and personal interactions. So let's talk about SARS for a second. And why is, whoops, there we go. This takes us back again to the early 2000s. So it was in about November of 2002 that the Chinese government started to recognize that there were a number of cases of respiratory illness that were causing pretty severe problems in Guangdong province. In November, they actually decided not to make any statement to the World Health Organization or to share that information. The reason for that is not entirely clear to me. So it really wasn't until actually earlier in 2003 that they actually made the report to the World Health Organization, letting them know that they had this severe acute respiratory syndrome. It was killing people, and they were concerned about it. So by the time the WHO found out about it and the rest of the world found out about it, there were cases detected throughout the world. And so this is a map of what was happening worldwide, in part because it had taken a while for the Chinese to share that information. So these won't look so different to you than what you're actually seeing today. It kind of took over everything, and certainly not to the extent that we're experiencing today by being asked to stay home and I think have it be declared the type of pandemic that we're dealing with right now. But, washing hands, people couldn't get face masks. Everybody was really scared and nervous. So the WHO on Monday, 17th, March 2003, actually called on 11 laboratories in 9 countries to join a collaborative multi-center research project to try to figure out what was going on. And so I don't necessarily expect you to read through all of these, but if you just take a quick look, you'll see that they were looking at labs in the Netherlands, we're seeing US, we're seeing China, Germany, Japan, France, countries, and Canada should be here somewhere. So we're looking at countries from around the world that were asked to collaborate together. They had to, in this context, really figure out how to coordinate efforts, how to work together, how to do this virtually, who was going to do what roles and responsibilities. All of that needed to be sorted out. And what is most compelling to me about this story is that literally 1 month later, April 16th, 2003, they identified the coronavirus that was the agent that caused the SARS outbreak in the early 2000s. if you think about this, this is a pretty amazing accomplishment to have happen in just a month. And the part of the story that I think I like best is the fact that if you were to ask any one individual who actually really identified it, who actually was the discoverer of this new coronavirus, the people in the team would say that it really wasn't, and it can't be attributed to one individual, because everything was so interconnected, everything was so interrelated and integrated across all of these teams. Samples were being shipped across the country, images were being shared, data was being shared, but no one person was really able to take credit. And so I think that shows you or gives you a sense of the power of teams. So I thought it might be helpful to just kind of pause for a second and say, well, what contributed to their success? If you, again, go back and think about the multi-lab nature, the multi-country nature, the complex problem they were asked to solve, the incredible coordination. So I would say one of the things that probably contributed to their success was trust. And I have here something called Swift Trust mentioned, and I will actually come back to this later in the presentation. They had a super clear shared goal and vision of what they were doing and what needed to be accomplished. They must have had an open mindset, a willingness to learn, a willingness to take in new things, understand the different perspectives of the different team members who were involved from around the world. They had super clear expectations. Their communication, both the logistical aspects, because if you think about it, this team met every day. So that means that, you know, there was one point in time during the day that they were meeting, which might have been the middle of the night for some people. So they had to figure out not only how to communicate logistically successfully, but also about the science. And then, as I mentioned, the willingness and the openness to share credit on a really complex project. So what I'd really like to do today is, I've already given you a little bit of background and context, and I'm going to do just a little bit more of that. And then I've put my talk into the framework of the stages of team development. And I will, of course, describe this in more detail. And I thought I would do that, again, because I think it's a nice framework, and I think it can provide, especially for a virtual talk, sort of a grounding and helping you think about if you're participating on a team or you're going to be starting up a team or leading a team. I think it provides a nice framework for really thinking about those elements that are important to think about that we don't always think about, or at least for me, was never trained to think about as a scientist. And I'm going to make a couple of comments about leadership at the end. And when I talk about leadership, I mean that, or I come from the perspective that we're all leaders. We lead from where we sit, from where we stand, from where we do our work. And so as a team leader or a participant, there are things that you can do to be a leader. So this was part of the additional context and background that I just wanted to share. I think it's becoming increasingly important to understand that really in the area of team science, in the field that's called the science of team science, we appreciate that there is a continuum from what we call unidisciplinary to transdisciplinary research. And so why is this important? I think one of the reasons this is important is that there are more and more calls out for funding that require the collaboration from an interdisciplinary group. And when people are writing grants, I will often see that people use a lot of these terms, especially the multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary interchangeably, and they're really not. So whether you become experts in the definitions or not, if you're ever going to write a grant and start including this language, I would pick one and just stick to it. But let's talk about the differences a little bit. Unidisciplinary is pretty easy. So this is researchers from a single discipline that work together to address a common problem. The next is multidisciplinary, and I think you can think about it most easily is that there are researchers from different disciplines, but they're working sequentially. They're each working from their own discipline, perspective, and they're adding value from that disciplinary perspective. But you're not necessarily making something new or integrating the knowledge from the individuals. It's sort of like if I have a set of samples and you have a technique from your discipline that could add some interesting data to a paper. I might use the samples for my techniques. I give you some of the samples so that you can run your assay. We look at the data together. It makes a nice paper. We write a paper, and then we may or may not collaborate in the future. So that's how to think about multidisciplinary. Interdisciplinary really kicks that up a level and starts to force or to leverage the fact that these different disciplines can be integrated more. And so instead of doing things sequentially, now you're jointly addressing common problems, you're integrating your perspectives, you might even be integrating some methodologies, learning to do something in a new way, develop a new technology. And so, but yet people are still pretty anchored in their own disciplines. So then that can take you to transdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary is really, again, you've got researchers from different disciplines that are working jointly, and now you're starting to meld the conceptual framework into a shared conceptual framework that really synthesizes the input from and the disciplines from all of the different individuals, so that you're really creating something new. And when I also think about transdisciplinary, I also think that this is often the time where you start to see more people involved, more people than you would say are necessarily quote unquote scientists. But this is the policymakers, the utility companies, the people from your communities and things like that, where you really need a lot more perspective. I've got a colleague who likes to show this slide, and people always seem to resonate with it a lot, so I asked her if I could borrow it. But you can think about unidisciplinary like an apple, so that's a single fruit. You can think about multidisciplinary like a fruit basket. So you have each of your disciplines, they're all sort of sitting together, but each fruit is still whole, even though you've got them all in a basket. Then if we move to interdisciplinary, so this is more like your fruit salad. So if you take a bite of strawberry, for example, you actually might taste a little bit of banana or a little bit of mango on it. So things are starting to meld a little bit more. And once you get to transdisciplinary, you get to the smoothie, which is everything's melded together. You might be able to take a taste and realize it's got strawberry and mango and banana in it, but you could never re-separate them. And so I hope you enjoyed that as much as other people have. And it's hard to not be able to look at the audience because sometimes people are smiling when I'm showing this, but I hope some of you are smiling. So I just wanted to mention again the field guide. Dawn mentioned this earlier. This is, I think they're sending it to you, which is really nice, but it's also freely available at the website shown. And also, if you prefer to have it as an ebook or as a Kindle version, it's there in that format as well, if you'd like to have it in that type of a form electronically. But a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is derived from the field guide. The field guide is actually originally a collaboration between me and the NIH ombudsman, who has since retired. He retired a few years ago from the NIH. But when I first started becoming interested in team science, it was a point in time where I was actually actively trying to bring teams together from across the intramural program at the National Cancer Institute. So we had basic researchers, clinicians, animal modelers, statisticians, epidemiologists, who were all, interested in particular areas of science or disciplines or areas of, or new areas of science. And so what we really tried to do is we tried to bring these people together across all of the disciplines to try to get them working together in ways that they hadn't before. And really wanted to try to understand, once we had done that, what was contributing to the success of some groups in actually doing that and creating these new teams, what was contributing to some teams getting stuck, and what was contributing to the failure of some teams. So we actually did a study originally with a woman by the name of Samantha Levine Finley, who was an author on our first edition. This is the second edition. And, you know, I think we really learned so much from that exercise that we thought it would be helpful to put together a little brochure, and the brochure turned into something a bit larger. But a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, you can actually find in the field guide. So that's a little bit about that. And I should also say, maybe it would be good to say too, you know, for me to collaborate with the ombudsman at the front was not immediately obvious in terms of a collaboration. But since he dealt with so many people in conflict and so many scientists in conflict at the NIH, he was really interested in trying to figure out, how can I move this backwards? How can I help them? How can I help them be more preventative in terms of how they're approaching their scientific collaborations? He used to tease me that he was the emergency room for failed scientific collaborations, because people always came to him in crisis. So I thought we made a pretty good team in doing this, actually. So let me introduce, well, you know what? Why don't we take a pause as promised, and see if there's any questions or comments up to this point, and then I'll move into this part.
Hi, Dr. Bennett. It does look like we have one question here, and they are asking, are there any limitations to sharing data across country borders or boundaries?
So that's a really great question, and yes, there certainly are some limitations and some challenges associated with that. I'm not in a position right now to pull all that information together, but I think a lot of people are aware, for example, of the personal information restrictions in the European Union that really don't exist here. And that can create a lot of trouble or a lot of challenges in how to share data or how to manage data across boundaries and borders. I think it's also fair to say that even within the United States, if one is interested in doing some research with the American Indians or Native Americans, you will find that with a lot of tribes, there are a lot of constraints about how to manage data because they're important things to them. So it's a great question, and it's definitely something that if you enter into international collaborations, and I would say even if you enter into national collaborations within the walls of the United States, it's important to have those conversations up front about how you're going to do a number of these things, including sharing data.
And we do have one person here that does want you to know that they did love the fruit metaphor, and they wanted to ask you if they could actually use that in their classes.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to share the slides. So I can send you the slides, Lauren and Kayla, so that you have them, and they certainly can be distributed.
Okay.
All right. If nothing else, then I'll move on to the next part. So here I'm going to introduce the model of team development. So the model of team development was really put forward in the 60s by a guy named Bruce Tuckman. And he came to this model of team development by studying a number of different types of teams, scientific teams included. And I think what I usually tell people is that it's easy to remember them because the way he teed them up, he has them all rhyming. And I'm sure he did that for a reason. And so the 4 stages of team development are forming, storming, norming, and performing. Those are the ones that he put forward in the 60s. And in the 70s, he added adjourning and transforming. And just for the purposes of today's talk, I'm not really going to spend a lot of time on the adjourning and transforming. If somebody's really interested, you're welcome to ask a question and I can go into it. But just to give you a sense of what's happening, the first step is to form the team, which sounds really obvious. So the team gets formed, and then the next step is the storming stage. And this is the stage where I like to think of it as sort of like people's elbows sort of get bigger and come out, and people are sort of nudging each other out of the way. So why would I say that? I would say that because you know, people aren't really trusting yet of the people that they're working with necessarily. The setting, the roles and responsibilities might not be clear. The vision might not be clear of what we're doing. I don't feel comfortable sharing my data yet. Personality differences. I don't want, you know, I think how somebody behaves or their personality is hard to deal with, so I don't want to interact with them. All a number of things come up in the storming phase that make it difficult for people to work together. Yet, during the storming phase, especially with groups, what's our tendency? What do we tend to do if we notice some tension? So I'm pausing a second just so you can think about that for a second. And what tends to happen is we try to suppress it, right? We try to push it down and push it back underneath the surface because we don't want tension. We want everybody to get along. Our default is to want harmony. And that doesn't always happen with teams. And if in a team they were to suppress these tensions, what's going to happen? You know, they're going to just emerge later. So storming's a really key part of this cycle. Some teams never make it out of storming to the norming phase, and they just sort of fall apart. So if you can get through storming, that takes you to norming, and norming is where the norms of the team are really established. Trust is developed, roles and responsibilities are clarified, how we're going to work together is clarified. So really the norms of the group are established in a way that we all have an understanding of how to work well together. And once you get through that stage, that puts you into the performing stage. And I really just liken this to a well-oiled machine. Things are humming, things are going really well, really comfortable. So 2 points about storming. The first one is it's not optional. The group has to go through storming. And I've actually found that in working with teams, it can be really, really powerful to use this language, because when I introduce the storming language to a team, especially one that's I just lost my word. They're in the process of storming. Somebody in the group will go, "Oh my gosh, we're storming." And people will say, "Oh yeah, we're storming." And somehow just having that vocabulary word is really reassuring to people. And so all of a sudden it makes it okay because we have a word we can use to describe what we're going through. The other thing about storming is that if the team loses some members or gains some members, they're going to go through another cycle of storming. So storming is something that can, you know, continue to go on. So now I'm going to move forward to the next slide and start to talk about each of these areas in turn. And I think what I'll do is I'll try to remember to stop after each of the stages, and then you can ask questions if you want, or you have something you want to comment on. So for forming, one of the first things I learned about the forming stage that I thought was really interesting is that it really doesn't matter how a team is formed. It can be formed top down, so that is the leadership says this is really important, or like the example in SARS that I gave you where the WHO said we need to address this problem, so top down invited labs to be involved in it. Or a team can be formed from the bottom up, investigators who have common interests, who come together to solve a complex problem. What we ended up discovering, though, is that success of the team really depends on top-down support. The leadership has to be supportive. And I've seen this over and over in a lot of institutions across the nation, where I'll go and I'll talk to people and they'll say, I'll hear from the leadership, they'll say, oh, this is, you know, team science is really important. But then when push comes to shove, the teams themselves don't really feel that supported by the leadership, and that can cause a real tension. So there really needs to be some congruence there. And, you know, if you're developing a team, it's always good to talk to the leadership to make sure you have their support. The other thing I wanted to mention in the context of forming is that, you know, I think we sometimes think that, oh, you know, as we're forming a team, it just happens. And it actually doesn't just happen necessarily. We can be super purposeful about who we're bringing into the team and how we're going to choose to work together. So when we were doing our research about research in asking different teams about what was working for them, what didn't work for them, how they were putting their teams together. One of the stories that I think struck me most was there was a person who headed a laboratory or headed a team, and he had hired somebody to work on the team that he believed was very interested in being a member of the team. When he interviewed the person, they said, oh yeah, that being in a team is really important to them. They like that sort of dynamic, so he hired him. And about a month into having this person on the team, it became super clear that this person had no interest in wanting to work with anybody else. They were really just sort of all about creating their own niche and doing their own thing. So that sort of fell apart. And so that got us to thinking a lot about how do you go about identifying people, the right people for your team. And there's actually a number of different interviewing and hiring models out there. And I just very briefly introduced three. One's called a values-based interviewing approach. And really this approach is designed to learn about the values of a candidate and determine if they match those of the ideal candidate. And so it's up to you to decide what those values are. And then you can design questions that actually get at that. So I can just give you a little bit of an example. I remember being on an interview panel. We were interviewing individuals for a very high level position. And we had one guy come in, and among the questions that we were asking each of the candidate was, you know, what are three things that are important about your work environment, and what are three things that are pet peeves for you in your work environment? And when he got to the pet peeve question, he said, well, one of my pet peeves is, you know, people with messy desks. And he said, I used to do walkthroughs of my area, and I would come up to somebody and see that they had a really messy desk, and you could just see the blood in his face moving, you know, up towards his head. This was a really big deal for him. And for us as an interview committee, it ended up being a deal breaker because, you know, for him to be that emotional about a topic like a messy desk, we just didn't think he would be an ideal candidate for the position. So that just gives you an example of the power that these types of interview questions can have. Performance-based interviews are focused on asking people questions about that let you understand whether or not they can actually do the job. So the way that you would ask the question is give me an example of how you've done this before, or how you would approach this problem. And then there are behavioral-based questions. And so this approach focuses on how an applicant would behave in very specific circumstances. So some of those circumstances might be an ethical conundrum or a data reproducibility issue or something like that, where you really get a sense of how they approach things. So that's really all I wanted to say about forming. So I'll just stop here quickly to see if anybody has any questions so far.
Hi, Dr. Bennett. We do have a few questions here. We have one that says, what should you do in terms of cohesion when the team changes, whether because the needs change or someone joins the team or someone decides to leave?
So that's a great question. And if you bear with me, I will actually start to talk about some of that as we move into the storming and norming sections.
Okay, and then we did have another one here, and it says, who is the leadership that you are referring to when faculty members decide to form a research collaboration?
So I think that's a really great question too, because I think I think anybody can serve in a leadership role. It just needs to be defined among the team how that leadership structure is going to be. And so I believe that, you know, trainees and postdocs can play leadership roles. Faculty can play leadership roles. It depends on how, you know, really where the idea came from and how people decide to come together and work as a team. One thing I didn't mention, but could mention too, is that one of the coolest things that I have observed in the context of collaborative teams is that it provides more and more opportunities for leadership. And so what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that when the team comes together around a complex problem and starts addressing it, just by the nature of science, more questions arise. And so what oftentimes happens in teams is that the group will look for somebody to step up and take on leadership of that project in the context of the whole. And so it's a really phenomenal opportunity for people more junior in their careers to step up and to take more of a leadership role. So I think leadership can be pretty fluid.
Okay, Dr. Bennett, we have someone that would like to ask their question. So
Sure.
I'm going to unmute Danita. Okay, go ahead.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi.
I didn't know that I was going to be have to ask this one on my own. I wanted to know, I am part of a multidisciplinary research team, and I've kind of been given the charge of streamlining our weekly meetings in a more efficient way, which hopefully will result in more productivity. We're very productive, but we tend to work on 10 to 15 manuscripts at one time and don't really put, I guess, we've just started to try to put deadlines on ourselves to get those manuscripts out, and we work on multiple projects at one time. So we have a lot of balls in the air, as I'm sure a lot of projects do. So I'm just thinking about what tools would you suggest, or is there a way to get us all, I guess, moving in the same direction as far as some of the smaller things, like, well, not smaller things, I guess, manuscripts and things like that, keeping track of those and getting them out the door quicker and, you know, in a more streamlined way.
Yeah. You know, I think there are a number of different things you could do. One of the things that I'm going to talk a little bit about are collaborative agreements. And so I think this is where I fall on the, you know, I guess fall into the realm of saying, you know, sometimes taking the time to really think about how the team is working together can be of tremendous value. It might for a little while feel like you're moving slower because you're taking the time to do this, but in the end, I think it can create a lot more efficiency. So I think it's in the next section, I'll be talking about collaborative agreements and what those look like. And I'm hoping that that helps to answer your questions a little bit.
We all work together in the same area. I thought, well, normally I usually think of collaborative agreements as external people working together, but
Yeah.
we're all together in one suite at our.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I would not underestimate the value of sitting down as a group and really talking about how we're going to work with each other.
Right.
You know, how are we going to, you know, decide on authorship? Sounds like you might have done that. You know, what's our sequence of events? What are we going to prioritize? It sounds like you've got a lot of balls in the air. And so being very purposeful with the group about what you're doing, very explicit. You know, I don't know if you've ever sat down with a group and said, hey, we've got so many balls in the air, you know, it's hard to keep track of everything. Is anybody else feeling this way?
Right.
And, you know, if somebody else might say, oh my God, yes, it's so hard. And then like, well, what can we do to, as a group, to make this better? You know, sometimes we don't talk about that, but taking the time to talk about that can be really beneficial. Does that help?
Yes, yes, thank you.
Sure.
Mhm.
Anything
Okay, and
else? Oh, yeah, go ahead,
yes.
Lauren.
And then we do have two questions here that I'm going to try to combine into one because they are kind of similar. So it's how do you decide what you do need to consider if values, performance, or behavioral based skills are the most important, and then how do you go to resolve a conflict if somebody is considering the other value to be more important than what you are when hiring somebody.
So, you know, I think the way that I think about using these different hiring models is that you can take values and performance-based and behavioral-based questions, and you can think about, so for you, for your team, what are the most important values that people demonstrate, or what are the most important performance criteria for the position. So the group of people who was thinking about doing the hiring can, you know, create or establish different questions that get at these things. And through that hiring process, you will learn a lot about the candidates. And I think that's the value in taking these approaches. You know, I don't have it, I didn't list it here, but like I have in my possession about maybe a 10-page document full of values-based questions. And so you think about, well, what are the questions that are really important to ask a candidate to get at how they view this or how they view that, you know? So do they have a value of wisdom or integrity or collaboration, or, you know, what's going to fit best into your team? So in a way, it requires the leadership of the team or the participants on the team to sit down and think about what's important for the team. If we're going to bring in a new person, what criteria are going to be important? Does that help, do you think?
Yes, we also had another question. With the way promotions are typically done in U.S. institutions,
Yes.
first and last author papers and grants as a PI appear to be paramount for promotion.
Yep.
How should this be navigated by junior and mid-level investigators?
Awesome question. So let's go so I'm going to actually talk about that in the storming section. So hold on, we'll get there.
Okay, and then there's a part 2 for that, so I'll put it up there, but
sure,
you may be answering it later.
Yeah, that's okay.
So this person has sat on NIH study sessions, and these same metrics also appear to be critical in securing funding. So they ask, what is changing at the NIH, and what can we do at individual institutions to change paradigms regarding how to navigate these key challenges?
Okay. Yeah, so I will try to remember to address that when I am in the storming phase. And if I forget, Kayla, please remind me when we pause next time.
Sure.
All right?
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, we ready to go? Okay, so we're going to go into storming now. And I think we've heard a number of questions that have really teed up this session really well. So I have a quote here from a paper that says, "We felt we had built up a better understanding by clarifying, justifying, and arguing." And I really like this quote a lot because I think it demonstrates pretty kind of clearly that that it does require, scientists do need to argue. And I don't necessarily mean it in in a negative way, and I don't think that they really meant it in a negative way either, but they had to kind of get through the differences and understand each other's perspectives in order to really develop into a really solid team. So I've got two areas that I'm going to speak about in the context of storming. One is setting expectations, and the other is differences in diversity. So the first one is setting clear expectations, and I think this is going to kind of fold into some of the questions that were asked. The way that I think about it is that setting expectations can really provide us a scaffold for deeper trust, and we're going to talk about trust in a little while. And it helps to avoid any secrets or surprises. It's a very transparent way of interacting with the group and making sure that there's clarity around how we're going to communicate, clear agendas for meetings, authorship, you know, how we're going to deal with authorship, how we're going to do the research, technical support, all the other things that are listed on that slide. So if I go to the next slide, so there are a number of tools that exist or have been created or you can create for actually setting expectations. So the first one is a collaborative agreement. So if you take a look at the appendix of the field guide, you'll see that there are 3 different areas. One is a collaborative agreement, one addresses the welcome letter, and the last one addresses, I think, the institutional agreements. And so I'll go through these. So again, I'll mention my collaborator, Howard Gadlin, who was the ombudsman at the NIH. And one of the things that he used to do is he would work, when he worked with these quote unquote emergencies or people who were encountering or experiencing failed scientific collaborations, he would oftentimes get them back on track by working with them to create a collaborative agreement. And so as we started thinking more about the collaborative agreement, it seemed like it was it had a potential of being a preventative measure, as much as something that could be used after the fact. So this is a jointly created agreement among the collaborators. It can be formal or informal in its creation. And some of the questions at the end of the field guide are like, well, when does the project start? When does the project end? What are the roles and responsibilities? What do we do if the media calls? How are we going to handle sharing of data? And how are we going to manage authorship? Things like that, so that there's explicit understanding and agreement among the different people who are participating on the team. Over the last, I would say, 10 years, I have gone from hearing people say, oh my gosh, I could never suggest to my team that we have a collaborative agreement because they'll think I don't trust them, to finding situations and institutions and organizations that actually require them for any sort of collaboration because they believe it's a solid way to get that collaboration off the ground. The welcome letter is very similar and different at the same time. The welcome letter actually came from, is really the brainchild of a guy named Rich Mariah at the National Institute of Child and Health Development at the NIH. So he's one of the investigators there. And Rich has put together an 8-page letter, yes, it's 8 pages, to anybody who is considering joining his laboratory. And in that letter, he articulates what he expects from the individual, what the individual can expect from him, and what they'll do if there's a disagreement. And now I always tell people that letters don't need to be 8 pages. They can be a couple of pages and just as effective. The other thing is that Howard and I took the welcome letter idea and sort of revamped it for teams, and have worked with a number of teams to put these welcome letters in place. Sometimes they're written by just a couple of the leaders on the team. Sometimes the leaders have taken it and worked with more people on the team to kind of come up with a letter that helps people, helps explain to people what they're all about. So it's another way of setting expectations. Next is institutional agreements, and then this is where I get, we'll get to the points that you were mentioning or somebody was asking about in terms of recognition and reward in your institution. It is no surprise to me, after doing this for over a decade now, that there are still institutions out there that are really struggling with how to recognize and reward individuals in the context of team science. I think typically more and more what I hear people say is like, oh, you can't recognize an individual accomplishment in the context of a team. It has to be all their individual work. And I really, really disagree with that. I think there are lots of ways to recognize individual accomplishment in the context of the team. There are institutions that are working really hard to figure this out. There are some institutions that are keeping shadow CVs where they're asking their PIs to keep 2 CVs. One, your clean CV, but another CV that's annotated for the purposes of promotion and tenure that articulate your role and your responsibility on each of the publications. Why was your involvement pivotal, especially if you weren't a first or last author? There are institutions that are now inviting letters of recommendation for tenure from collaborators. So you may know, or there are institutions out there that will say, well, we can't ask for a letter of recommendation from a collaborator because it'll be biased. I actually see it very differently in that who knows better than your collaborators whether you're truly contributing at a leadership level in the context of that collaboration, or just holding on to the coat strings of this collaboration, hoping it'll benefit you in some way. So one of the other types of institutional agreements that I urge people to consider are things like offer letters or pre-tenure letters. So what does that look like? So I can give you one example. I worked with an investigator at the NIH who had a team, and he was really interested in hiring a new faculty member into his team. And he really wanted that person to be a functioning member of the team, and didn't want them to get caught in this challenge around recognition and reward. And so I actually helped him write the offer letter that articulated that part of the expectation of this individual was to be involved in team, to be doing team science, to be collaborative, and that so that this letter could be presented to the board that does the reviews of the individual, both at the outset when they were hired, and then when they came up for their tenure review, that there was clear documentation that this was an expectation so they could be evaluated appropriately. I think this is something that can be done in the context of an institution as well. So again, I've talked to many junior investigators who have had the experience of being recruited to an institution based on the perceived value that they can bring to collaborative projects at that institution. And then once there, being told they shouldn't collaborate until after they're tenured, which of course creates a huge conundrum. And so I think another thing I always encourage people to do is to go talk to the leadership. Come up with an agreement with the leadership about your role. If you didn't do it while you were negotiating for the position, do it as a pre-tenure investigator and make sure that there's some language for which you'll get credit. And then there was the question about what about the NIH? What are we doing differently at the NIH? I think if you look over time, you'll see that there are more and more examples of funding opportunity announcements that are coming out that are expressly indicating the need for multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary teams. We have seen the volume of multi-PI R01 applications come in grow massively over the last, I'd just say maybe 5 or 6 years. So I think people are really taking advantage of the opportunity to be collaborative in the context that of the funding. And I think that to just get back to the person's question about review panels, I think it's probably gonna lag a bit, but I hope that the review panels come along too and people start to bring these mindsets around the need for collaboration a little bit better. So that was a lot in one slide and a lot of talking from me. Consortium agreements, again, as people are creating these larger and larger consortia, those types of agreements are also really critical. How are we going to publish together? How are we going to manage our data? What about biospecimens? Things like that. To have agreements at the consortium level can be very powerful. So the next place that I want to go in the context of storming is to talk about diversity. And so when I think about diversity, I think about diversity in the context of team science as being probably the broadest interpretation of diversity as possible. You know, we're talking about different perspectives, different backgrounds, different disciplines, different ranges of expertise, different ways of asking questions, interpreting, different methods, methodologies, approaches. So I really think about it that way, in addition to the other dimensions of diversity, such as backgrounds, where people grew up, what schools they went to, what culture they bring to the team, for example. And I also want to point out that the more difference you have in the team when you're setting it up, the more dimensions of difference you have, the more of a challenge it will be to get through the storming period. And working through the storming period is to your benefit, because that way you can leverage all of these different dimensions of difference and probably have a richer approach to the scientific question than you could if everybody were the same and agreed on everything up front. So I'm just going to describe a few areas of difference or diversity that I think are particularly intriguing. I'm starting with women because why not? But there's data out there on evidence that indicates that the more women you incorporate into your teams, the smarter that they are. So the research really says that there's little correlation between a group's collective intelligence and the IQs of its individual members. But if a group includes more women, its collective intelligence rises. And so this data is based on something called the theory of use. And what that is that women have a more innate ability to really understand what's happening in the context of the team, to be able to take cues of things like body language, tone of voice, and to really help to, I think, create more cohesion within the team because of their presence. A lot of this research has actually resulted in the state of California requiring that women serve on boards, which you may be aware of. Problem solving. So this is work done by Hong and Page in, again, the early 2000s. So what they did is that they wanted to try to determine whether a diverse group or a homogeneous group was more effective at solving a problem. So they randomly selected individual intelligent participants from a diverse group and then kind of pitted them up against a team of the best performers. And what they ended up determining was that it was the randomly selected intelligent participants from the diverse group that outperformed the best performers. So there's just a note at the bottom that kind of restates what I stated earlier, that, you know, as the diversity of the team increases, they're more likely to run into challenges of communication. And it will take longer for them to build trust, but once they've done that, they will be more powerful. So really that result from the last slide just really means that a team of experts is not necessarily an expert team. And I think this is important because as scientists, we often think, oh, I need to put a team together, and you want to identify the best experts from you know, the different disciplines that you can. And I just want to say that that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be an expert team or they're going to work well together. So something to consider. Mixed gender scientific teams produce research articles to consider to be of higher impact than those comprised of a single gender. Mixed gender teams receive 34% more citations than publications produced by single gender teams. So a side benefit of this is it promotes diversity. And then I also wanted to show this slide. I actually want to show you a video, and I'm hoping that this works. I really like the video that I'm going to show you, and I like it for the following reason, is that when we create teams, making sure we've got difference, that we're honoring a number of different disciplines and differences and making sure the right people are at the table. We constantly have to ask ourselves over time, do we have the right people at the table? Are we missing anybody? And I think this video really shows you, it's very illustrative in the importance of doing that. And so, okay, so let's do it this way. I'm going to explain to you what's happening in the video. So there are two people standing in front of an HP Media Smart computer. First, you see this guy named Desi, and Desi's black. And he's standing in front of it, and he's explaining to you that this Media Smart computer is supposed to do face tracking. And then he tells you that he thinks the fact that he's black is getting in the way of that computer being able to track him. And so he moves around, he moves, his face back and forth, up and down, trying to get the computer to recognize him, and it doesn't. Then he has a coworker with him named Wanda, and he says, Wanda, come here. And it turns out that Wanda's white. And so when Wanda gets in front of the computer, you can see the computer actually shift and then focus in on her. And then as she's moving from side to side and up and down, the computer is tracking her. And then he says, I'm going to sneak in. And he goes, I'm sneaking in. And he comes into the frame. And when he gets into the frame, everything stops. The computer just goes static again. And then when he goes out of frame, the computer starts moving around again. And so where I usually stop the video is when Desi comes back in and he says, I'm going to go on world record and say it that HP computers are racist. And so that's when I usually stop the video. And as I said, I'm sorry?
I'm sorry. Could you potentially, in sharing your screen, pull up that video and then share your screen again?
Oh, yeah, I can try. Yeah, sure.
We
Okay.
should hopefully be able to see.
Oh, I just have to reshare? Ah, okay. All right, so let me try. So do I stop share and then reshare?
Yes. So now pull up that video on your screen and then share that.
This, no following.
I have to get back into the Zoom, I think. Oh, I see, share, here we go. Ho, ho, ho. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Ha ha, you're so smart. Okay, so here you go. Now that I've explained it, you get to see the video.
It's all the people in the chat. They're smart.
This is using the video tracking software.
All right.
Explain.
My coworker Wanda and I are sitting in front of an HP Media Smart computer. State-of-the-art computer, wouldn't you say?
I'd say.
We're using the face tracking software, so it's supposed to follow me as I move. I'm black. I think my blackness is interfering with the computer's ability to follow me. As you can see, I do this, no following. Not really follow me. I back up, I get really, really close to try to let the camera recognize me, not happening. Now, my white coworker, Wanda, is about to slide in the frame. You will immediately see what I'm talking about. Wanda, if you would, please.
Sure.
Now, as you can see, the camera is panning to show Wanda's face. It's following her around. But as soon as my blackness enters the frame, which I will sneak into the frame. I'm sneaking in, I'm in there.
That's it.
And there we go, it stopped. My hands are here. Wanda, please get back in the frame. Get back in. As soon as white Wanda appears, The camera moves. Black Desi gets in there. Oh, nope. No face recognition anymore, buddy. I'm going on record and I'm saying it. Hewlett Packard computers are racist. I said,
All right,
Great.
so that was the video. And again, I really like it because I think it really forces, I think it makes the point very strongly that we really need to always reconsider who's on our team. Do we have the right people on the team? It won't surprise you that this video went viral a number of years ago, and HP didn't really handle it very well. If you're interested, you can go and take a look. But that's sort of the end of the storming phase. We've got norming and performing to do, and I'm looking at the time and I'm realizing that I might need to speak a little bit faster, but let's see if there's some questions that people have, and then I'll go into the next section.
Okay, it looks like there are a couple of questions. Looks like one of them is, how do you remove a member from the team that you realize isn't a good fit?
That's where having a difficult conversation comes in. It's, you know, I think that's where we start to, I think that's where becoming good at or better at having difficult conversations come in. You know, I think if somebody's not a good fit and there's a lot of clarity for you about why they're not a good fit, it just requires a series of conversations to try to figure out what's not working, and if it's truly something that can't be fixed, then trying to figure out how you can go separate ways.
And then also, when discussed, the single gender teams have less publications. Does that include all women teams?
Yes, yeah. So having a mixture of genders is more powerful than single gender teams.
And we also have a question from Jan. I'm going to unmute you. So Jan, can you? Jan, if you'll unmute yourself. There you go.
No, there was no question. It was just a comment about the video.
Oh, go ahead.
All right, well, why don't we move on then? We'll go to norming, and I'll try to speed it up a little bit. So again, norming is the stage where things start to sort of come together for the team. I'm going to talk about 3 dimensions. That's developing trust, establishing norms for communicating across disciplinary languages, and managing conflict. So the first thing I really wanted to talk about was trust. And that is because trust really underpins all of the interactions that you're going to have in a team dynamic. It really sits at the bottom. It's extremely fundamental. So if we look at humans fall into really 2 categories. There about 50% of the population starts a relationship high trust, and another 50% starts the relationship low trust. And so what that means is that if I start a relationship high trust, I'm looking for the person that I am working with to help to maintain that trust. And if I'm starting out low trust, I'm looking for that other person to work with me such that I'm building the trust in them. And so if you just think for a moment what that means when you're working with somebody new, if you don't know if they start high trust or low trust, it's something that it's helpful to kind of keep in mind about how you potentially start working together. And I oftentimes, when I'm in a group, I'll walk up to somebody and say, I very rarely do this when I'm interacting with people, and I stretch my hand out and I shake hands. I say, hi, I'm Michelle, I'm high trust. We usually don't talk to people like that. And so it needs to be something that you're aware of and then think about. So here are some different types of trust. There are many, many different types of trust. I often tell people that if you want to spend your whole life studying trust, you could. It's actually a really fascinating area. So I just want to touch really quickly on 4 types of trust. One is calculus-based trust. So this is like the type of trust you have if you are in a laboratory or a clinic and you have standard operating procedures. You will watch and you will see if people are following the standard operating procedures or not, and you will come to trust them or to distrust them more based on their willingness to follow the guidelines. Competence-based trust is really built on the confidence of people's skills and abilities. And so you allow them to make decisions and train others based on their competence. One example might be, going to a car mechanic. You might not know them, but they might be your favorite mechanic because they always do a great job. Identity-based trust is the type of trust that we preserve really for those people most special in our lives. And then there's the SWIFT trust. SWIFT trust is really built on the assumption that the participants are trustworthy. And this often happens in situations where you have to do something very quickly, the goal is super clear and the time is limited. And that was the reason at the beginning of the presentation I suggested that the team that was brought together by the WHO was probably operating under SWIFT trust. The greater the proportion of experts a team had, the more likely it was to disintegrate into non-productive conflict or stalemate. This comes from an article that I really like from the Harvard Business Review that was focused on teams. I think this is a kind of a way for me to segue into the notion of mindset and the importance of mindset as it pertains to being a collaborator. Some of you might be familiar with the work of Carol Dweck. It's gotten very popular recently. She spends a lot of time talking about the growth mindset or the fixed mindset. So why is mindset so important? Mindset is important because mindset guides our behavior and influences how we behave, and how we behave really impacts our results. And a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about in the next couple of slides is from Roger Schwartz and Associates, and the link is there if you're interested. So there are 2 types of approaches that mindsets that we can have. We can have a unilateral control approach, and as Roger Schwartz describes it, we are all experts in unilateral control by the age of about 5. So the values are win, don't lose, be right, minimize expressions of negative feelings, act rational. Assumptions are I understand, those who disagree don't. I'm right, those who disagree are wrong. I have pure motives, those who disagree don't. My feelings and behavior are justified, and I'm not contributing to the problem. So this is a really fixed mindset. It's a closed mindset. He describes it again as being very unilateral in nature. So by comparison, here's the mutual learning approach. The values are transparency, curiosity, informed choice, accountability, and compassion. The assumptions are I have information, so do other people. Each of us sees things, others don't. People may disagree with me and have pure motives. Differences are opportunities for learning, and I may be contributing to the problem. So I think just looking at this slide, you can see how this benefits, this mindset benefits and can contribute to really positive collaboration. The mutual learning ground rules are stated here. I won't go into all of them, but what I will say is that these are the behaviors. So when I said mindsets influence behavior, mutual learning mindset can really lead to these behaviors, whereas a unilateral one makes it more difficult to get there. So if I tee it up this way, so if you are determined to win, or you think you're right and the other person is wrong, it's going to be really hard to be curious and transparent. And if it's really hard to be curious and transparent, it's going to be really difficult to use these types of behaviors. your behaviors are going to be more focused on positions or not testing assumptions or not jointly designing next steps. So that's sort of what I wanted to tee up for sort of mindsets, behaviors, and results. When I do this session as a workshop, we tend to go through the conflict styles introduced by Thomas and Kilman. I think this is really valuable information to know. It helps you understand your conflict style, and it helps you then better understand the conflict styles of other people. When I do this as a workshop, we break up into groups, and I have people look at the definitions of each of the styles. They then write a pro and a con for each of the styles, and then we stick them on stickies and they sort them. And really basically what we come up with is the notion that if you think about these different styles, there's no one right style, there's no one wrong style. Each of the styles is valuable in its own situation and for its own purposes. So I think I just wanted to tee this up to you and let you know that it existed, and then let you see if you could potentially explore it on your own or in groups. But I think this is a good framework to have because, again, we all approach conflict and communication differently, and understanding your styles is really helpful. It helps you understand other people's styles better as well. And I'm just going to skip that. So I want to watch the time. We're sort of short on time. Do you have time for maybe one question, Kayla, and then I can, or Lauren, and then I can kind of try to buzz through the rest of this?
Sure. It does look like we have two questions that were submitted in the chat. One is, what's more important for the team, the person's expertise or their personality fit?
I love that question. I'm wondering if I have my quote. I don't have my quote here. So both. It is super important for the leader of a team to be both task-oriented as well as relationship-oriented. There's in that same article of the Harvard Business Review that I showed you earlier, it actually did a study that led to the determination that even if a leader starts out a team and is very task-focused, in order to be truly successful, they had to add to that a relationship component. So relationship and task are both very important. Love the question, great. And that's what basically this slide says too. So there's the quote and the resource if you're interested in reading the article. I'm gonna just skip over listening. Listening's really important, but given time, I'm not gonna stress it too much. Shared vision is absolutely critical for a team. And if you think about it, it's important when you're forming the team to be clear on your vision. And the reason I put it up in the performing stage is that a shared vision is important to come back to. As you move forward with the science, things are going to change, things are going to shift, and you need to be constantly mindful of your goal and the vision moving forward. A couple of things that we learned is that for really successful teams, everybody on the team can describe the big picture. And when you talk to the individual team members, they all understand very clearly how their project, what they're doing, contributes to the larger whole. And this is true for summer students, as well as animal handlers, as well as administrators, as well as the people who are more senior on the project. The whole goal is to get to a point where we can share perspectives and invite disagreement while we're containing effective and personal conflict. So I just wanted to mention something about psychological safety, which aligns really, really closely with trust. So what is psychological safety? It's being able to show and employs oneself without fear of negative consequences or self-image, status, or career. A shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. And it describes a team climate characterized by interpersonal trust and mutual respect in which people are comfortable being themselves. Amy Edmondson created this assessment for psychological safety, and so I'll just let you can kind of read through it while I'm talking. But the bottom line is that by the performing stage, you have hopefully established a psychological safety within the group, which basically means anybody can speak up, anybody can challenge the results of somebody else, anybody can make a point. If there are people in the group who have a fear of speaking up for any reason, it's not a psychologically safe environment, and that puts the team at risk, largely because you're not hearing from everybody in the group. Not everybody's able to share their voice. So I'm just going to sort of end on leadership. I think when we put the field guide together, we really thought that we would understand better what it takes to be an effective leader. And I think we came to understand and realize that there is really no formula. But we were able to extract some of the characteristics of really great leaders. And they include self-awareness as well as other awareness, having a shared responsibility for success, accountability, mentoring others, being able to manage up and across, the psychological safety that I just mentioned. Having difficult conversations is absolutely essential. So if you're not good at it, I'd say keep practicing. Even if you can get to not so bad from not good, that's progress. Speaking up and challenging ideas, giving your best every day. And then serving as a role model. I think one thing that happens a lot for people who are stepping into leadership positions is they don't realize how closely people are watching them. And it's when leaders are doing things, they are basically modeling their behavior, modeling behavior for others. People are going to do what they see. They're not going to do what they hear. And so I think that's important to recognize. So that's to just end on the model of team development there. And if there are any questions in the last couple of minutes, we can get to them.
So there was one that was posted a little bit earlier. What are the best ways to resolve discrepancies between contributions offered by 2 or more researchers to leadership? And this is varying perspectives offered to leadership that can create a storming situation.
Can you say that again for me, please?
So the question is, what are the best ways to resolve discrepancies between contributions offered by 2 or more researchers when they're offered to leadership?
I'm having trouble understanding exactly what that means. Different perspectives offered to leadership, does that have to do with credit? Or I'm not understanding the foundation of the question.
Yeah, it just says varying perspectives that are offered to leadership by 2 or more researchers, which is creating a storming situation, because I guess leadership is receiving,
Yeah, so I think if you were to go back, and once I send out my slides, it might be easier to do this. If I send out my slides, I think learning how to have conversations with people about those differences of opinion, differences of perspective, so that you can really understand why are you coming to these different perspectives? Why are you thinking about this in such different ways? So maybe one example I can use is I've been working with a couple of groups actually recently on what I would say positions versus interests. So there are some group members who are saying A is really important, and other group members are saying no, Z is really important. And so I don't understand in this group why the group that thinks A is important, why they think it's important, or why the people think that Z is important. And so what we've started to do is to uncover and try to have people explain their interests. What are your interests? What's driving your perspectives? What is underneath how are you coming to your perspective? I think by doing that, it can help you really understand at a deeper level what's motivating people to come to their conclusions, and it can break open a whole different kind of dialogue. this kind of gets back to the being very transparent and being very curious with each other and really spending some time trying to understand where the differences come from.
And then someone also said that they said that the seminar has been very helpful. Are there a list of books or additional resources on these topics that you would recommend that people could look into and get more detail about conflict resolution, team building, potentially aside from your field guide that you provided?
Yeah, well, if you take a look at the back of the field guide, there are a number of references listed, so that would be a good place to start. If you're familiar with Mendeley, it's an open access sort of reference listing, and they've got a Science of Team Science group in there, and there's a lot of publications in the area of team science that you could peruse as well. There's also something called the Team Science Toolkit that's at the NCI. If you were to Google Team Science Toolkit, you'll find a lot of tools and resources there as well.
We also had another question. Someone asked, can you quickly define the adjourning and transforming stage?
Sure. So it's very much like it sounds. So the adjourning stage is so what Bruce Tuckman came to understand is that, you know, a lot of times teams just fizzle out. You're on a team for a long time and it just stops meeting and you don't know what happened, and all of a sudden the team's not meeting anymore. And so what he said is that for adjourning a team, it's really, really important when the teamwork is ending, however it ends, to honor the fact that everybody contributed, played a role in the team, and to celebrate the fact that it existed and to honor the fact that it's ending. So to be very purposeful about that. And then the other thing he said is that a lot of times what will happen with teams is that they will reform. And so, you know, the arrow kind of says that the team composition can transform, the mission can transform, but many of the same people may continue working together, and you might add new membership to the team. So that takes you back to sort of this transformation or the kind of reforming. And then it puts you, of course, back on the cycle, needing to go through the storming again in the norming before you'll get back to performing.
It is 10:30, but Dr. Bennett, would you take one more question?
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
Someone posted that I've often heard lab groups refer to themselves as a family. Since families are often dysfunctional, is the analogy appropriate or should it be discouraged?
To call yourselves a family? Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, I can't really take a position on whether people should call themselves a family or not. I mean, I agree that, you know, I think it was Tolstoy, wasn't it, who said something about something about that all families are dysfunctional in their own way. And I think that's probably true for a lot of teams as well, is that there's probably dysfunction at some level. I think that, you know, I think whatever people want to call themselves that makes them happy, or if calling themselves a family does lend some sense of cohesion to the group, I guess I would just say more power to them.
Great. I see that some people are starting to log off, so I just want to remind everyone that there is an evaluation survey that will pop up in your browser. Once you exit, please complete the survey so that we can get feedback on Dr. Bennett's wonderful presentation today. For those that are still on, we do have one more. I'm going to wrap this up, but one hand raised from someone. It says, okay. Sam, I will allow you to talk. Unmute you. And then unmute yourself, Sam.
Thank you. How do we get more researchers beyond the universities who are participating? The academic health centers are very involved, but how do we get other clinicians motivated to join these teams?
How do we get more clinicians to join the teams?
Yes.
That's a really great question. I think one of the things that I've learned over time is that people really need to see the value of the team in the context of what they're doing as well. Sometimes, basic researchers or people will reach out, and I mean, it can happen at any level, but people will reach out to other people to join a team based on what I think I'm going to get out of it if you participate. And I think we always need to keep in mind that it's more of like matchmaking. It's more of like dating. You're looking for a really good match, and that other person really has to see the benefits of the collaboration, how it's going to help them as well. I suspect that clinicians also have some challenges in terms of, their time that a basic scientist, for example, might not, or an engineer might not. So maybe part of it is trying to work with them and help to figure out if there's a way for them to, get some support or free up a little bit of their time so that they could be more of a participant. It's a great question though, and I'm certain I don't have all the answers, but it would be fun to pull a group of people together and really have that conversation there, and to see if you guys can come up with some interesting ideas about what might be possible.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bennett. We will wrap up here. Everyone, as you exit, please complete the survey. We appreciate you for attending. Thank you, Dr. Bennett, so much for such an informative presentation. We had lots of comments saying how much everyone enjoyed it and thanking you for your time.
Oh, well, thank you. It's my pleasure. Again, I wish I had been able to be there in person, but I really appreciate the interaction along the way, and maybe I hope to see you next year.
Yes, likewise. Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.